like anything else, it's like, well, if it's bad for other organ systems in the body, what are the potential neurobiological consequences? And what the overall takeaway message was is that we saw that age interacted with the total number of drinks consumed over lifetime to give you thinner cortex across the cerebral cortex, and then as well as lower perfusion on average across the cortex. But the brain is one of the last frontiers to be looked at because neuroimaging is expensive. It can be a pain in the butt to process, and it's just easier to look at other organ systems because it's more accessible in terms of the way to interrogate the effects.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to one of Alcohol Review's occasional short video news interviews. You'll find more on the webpage and the YouTube show notes. Please like and subscribe on there and check the link to see the benefits of the full service. So let's get started. At high levels, alcohol consumption is associated with brain diseases and dysfunction, but there's little evidence of what happens at levels commonly thought of as low risk. A paper published this week has looked to narrow this gap in the research, so I'm delighted to be joined by one of the authors of the paper, Tim Durazzo, an associate professor at Stanford University. Welcome, Tim.
Thanks for having me, Phil. Appreciate the invitation.
You're very welcome. I'd like to start quite broadly, if I may. Could you explain what is currently known about what alcohol consumption can do to the brain across the range of consumption levels?
Well, as you pointed out, most of the research on the effects of alcohol consumption have been primarily focused on individuals with an alcohol use disorder, or what would be considered at hazardous drinking for folks that are not actually in treatment for an alcohol use disorder. And hazardous alcohol consumption, by definition, by the National Institutes of Alcohol and Alcoholism at NIH, is basically 5 or more drinks for a male or 4 or more drink equivalents for a female in a specified period of time, typically 2 hours. That's considered binge drinking. And we know that is hazardous for the brain, particularly upon repeated episodes. But those folks, in terms of the actual population who consumes alcohol, it represents a fraction, really.
Okay, just a bit of a note for non-American viewers and listeners is that a standard drink varies from one territory or country to another. In America, it's about 18 milliliters of alcohol, or, the pure alcohol. And so those are the amounts you might have to go back and sort of do the conversion for yourselves. And there is this gap in knowledge, as you mentioned there, at the lower levels. Is there a particular reason why there is this gap from a sort of scientific perspective?
Well, it's one of those things hiding in plain sight, perhaps. People were just going, well, drinking at that level can't really be bad for you. And when they say that, where's the empirical evidence to say that drinking at any level is without consequences? Low risk doesn't necessarily mean no risk.
Right. I think I've actually run into this in the past when I've looked at the British low risk guidelines, and the brain's element of it isn't really considered. So, it's not just in America. This is a bit of a missing element. And what is it that your research has done to fill in this gap? What do we know now that we didn't before?
Well, first of all, I got to give the caveat that the manuscript that you're referring to, it's very modest sample sizes, largely because those individuals served as controls for studies in which we looked at the neurobiological consequences of alcohol use disorder. So we needed a quote unquote normal reference group to compare these individuals to. And then what inspired me really to do this is over the past, I'd say 20 years, but particularly the past 10 years, is that any level of alcohol consumption is now, I think, in a large epidemiological studies, being shown to put people at risk for different forms of cancer, at least 7. And if I'm remembered, it's mouth, pharynx, larynx, esophageal, upper GI, and then colorectal cancer in males, and then, of course, for females, breast cancer. And so, like anything else, it's like, well, if it's bad for other organ systems in the body, what are the potential neurobiological consequences? But the brain is one of the last frontiers to be looked at because neuroimaging is expensive. It can be a pain in the butt to process. And it's just easier to look at other organ systems because it's more accessible in terms of the way to interrogate the effects.
Right, and what did you find? I know you mentioned it's a small group. I think it's 45 people, wasn't it? And your n equals 45 in this case. And what did that show you?
So we looked at two different neuroimaging measures. One, structural, that had an N of 45, number of participants 45, and then we looked at something called perfusion, which is a measure of brain blood flow, and that was an even smaller sample size, 27 participants. And what the overall takeaway message was is that we saw that age interacted with the total number of drinks consumed over lifetime to give you thinner cortex across the cerebral cortex, and then as well as lower perfusion on average across the cortex. Now, were these effects at a level where you would go, oh, geez, nobody should be drinking? No. But what it's indicating is that there's enough signal there to suggest that age, we know it has effects on the brain. You can't escape birthdays. But what we really were impressed upon here is that just the total number of drinks with increasing age was related to lower average perfusion across the cortex, as well as lower average thickness of the cortex. And this had not been shown before in this level of alcohol consumption, which would be considered low risk or, in some people's books, no risk. The folks in this study drank less than 60 equivalents a month over the year prior to the study. And on average, over lifetime, their average drinks per month was only about 21. So these individuals were very light drinkers across their entire lifespan.
Right, and I mean, obviously, there's a limit to what you can, take from a study of such a small size. But if you were to err on the side of caution, if you're trying to look after your brain, I guess the conclusion is you should try and reduce the amount of alcohol you drink as a starting point.
Yes, if you drink only 60 drink equivalents a month, which was at the top end, if you multiply the total number of drinks that is over lifetime, it becomes rather substantial, but it's spread out. And that's the results to us is that it's the cumulative effects. We were surprised that 1 year and 3 year average drinks per month were not related to any of our brain imaging measures. It was the cumulative effects over lifetime that interacted with age to give the results that we found.
Okay, and you mentioned, I mean, as we've not acknowledged, there are significant limitations to this piece of research. Is there a next step to take to be a bit more firm about these conclusions? Absolutely.
This has to be scaled up in a sample size that is triple or quadruple what we did to see if the effects hold. If they do, then there may be some indications about advising people for what is going to be adaptive for your brain over the long term. And there's also some genetic biomarkers that we need to integrate in the way people metabolize alcohol, which could be explaining a lot of what we saw in our studies. And then really to look at other functional effects of alcohol, like on balance and motor coordination, which are in process right now in my lab. Look at the functional consequences, if you will, rather than say, okay, we see these neurobiological consequences. How does this relate to folks' everyday behavior?
Well, that's a fascinating insight. I'll, as I mentioned at the start, I'll link to the paper in the show notes and any sort of blurb on the website version of this. Thank you very much for sparing the time. You've given a lay person some very valuable insights. So thank you very much.
Absolutely, I appreciate it.